So after the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, they were led for 40 years in the desert, the Exodus, evoked by that first reading today from Deuteronomy, put to the test in the desert. Well, and so is Jesus. After he crossed the Jordan, so to speak, after his baptism, as it says, he was led by the Spirit into the desert as well for 40 days. And so are we led into the desert. Well, for 40 years or 80 years or however long we live. In a way, our whole life is a desert. And sometimes we actually go on retreat. We say go into the desert to a retreat place to experience God more deeply. And by that very fact, if we open ourselves to experience God more deeply, we're going to experience ourselves and the devil, the negative impulses circulating in the world and in our own heart. We'll experience them more deeply as well. But we've got to. Deuteronomy says in so many words, the Lord led you into the desert to test you and afflict you to see what is in your heart. Now, after Jesus' baptism, remember that, as we saw at the feast of the baptism, he had a revelation of God about himself as the suffering servant. So here he is, the Messiah, the Son of God, and he's the suffering servant. So obviously, for him and for us, the temptations in the wilderness are going to be, will you act like a suffering servant, or will you act like a selfish, self-centered, power-hungry, ego-centered fool? His temptations are our temptations. It's the human temptation. He's the Son of Man. And we're going to face the same temptations. So what are those? They're narrated and numbered differently, enumerated differently in the various Gospels. But let's start with that main temptation. It's the last one in Matthew. It's the middle one here in Luke. The devil's showing him all the kingdoms of the world in a single instant. And they are all united in eternity anyway, but he says, I'll give you all this since they've been handed over to me, which is already a lie, of course. They're not handed over to the devil. The devil's the father of lies, and there's a lie right there. However, he has a good reason to say that, in the sense that it does often seem like all the kingdoms of the world and their glory and their power and their, sadistic, search for empire and domination really do belong to the devil. The prince of this world, he's called with some good reason. Just look around at the Ukraine today. Some power-hungry, egocentrical idiot, spreading his power over the earth, trampling on anyone who gets in the way, worshiping the devil, in fact, and getting the power handed over to him, for a while anyway. But remember what Jesus said. What good does it do to gain the whole world? Never mind Ukraine. The whole world. And suffer the loss of your own soul. And of course, every human life is precious. And none should be dominated and controlled. So, nonetheless, the devil says, I'll give this all to you if you worship me. And of course, you worship the devil every time you worship yourself. It's the same thing. And you're a liar too, because you're not the center of the world either. Every time you're seeking, power, domination, manipulation over others, you're worshiping the devil. You're worshiping yourself, which I say is the equivalent. So, how should we live? Well, we should live in the world as the servant. We should give up all desire for power. As has been said very well, only those should be entrusted with power who don't need it and don't want it. They're the only ones who should be entrusted with any kind of power. Because then it's not self-serving. So we give up all of that. Peter says to Jesus in the Gospels, we've left everything and followed you. We've left, husband and wife and children and lands. And then Jesus says, interestingly, There's no one who hasn't given up all this stuff who will get 100 times as much in this world, along with persecutions, and in the end, eternal life. It's just like St. Paul says to the Corinthians, we possess nothing, and yet everything is ours. See, that's the irony of it. When you give up the desire to dominate and control and have power, then everything is yours. If you really are at the service of all, then you'll have, brothers and sisters and lands, and everything will be yours because you're not seeking anything to be yours. It's like God. It's like Jesus, not seeking anything for themselves. So everything is theirs. Or put it the other way around. Everything belongs to God, so he doesn't need anything for himself. It's all at our service, in case you haven't noticed. So living perfectly selflessly, as Jesus does, and as God does, and as all the saints of whatever tradition do, then you'll discover the secret of life, and you won't need to bolster up your fragile, silly little, passing ego with all of these, crutches. I have power over this, I have power over that, I have power over these people, I'm the boss of this, the CEO of that. You don't need it. And you certainly won't misuse it if you do get it. You'll be at the service of those in your power, because that's what true power is. Sharing power and sharing the gifts and being at the service of one another. The suffering servant will lead to suffering often enough. But we're followers of Jesus, the Son of Man, who gives us the example and gives us the power to live as he does. And by the way, certain mystical or spiritual writers have pointed out that these three temptations can correspond to the three traditional religious vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. So this would be obedience. You shall serve the Lord your God alone, obeying only God and not your own ego and your own power-hungry impulses. And as I say, as we see in the world today, all over the world, not just in the Ukraine, this is really tough. Most people, and certainly most men, find it really hard to live this way. Not to dominate others, but to be at the service of others. The secret of life. So in that perspective, let's look briefly at the two other temptations. Poverty, religious vow of poverty. If you're the Son of Man, if you're the Son of God, rather, notice how he's jabbing him there. If you're the Son of God, command that this stone become a loaf of bread. So we see Jesus in the Gospels multiply loaves of bread for others, using his gifts and his powers for others, but not for himself, even though he's hungry after 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. You're poor, trusting on God to fill your needs. So if you're not looking to nourish yourself, but to nourish others, again, the unexpected, almost paradoxical reward is that you're nourished. When we seek only to nourish others, we are nourished by that very deed, but constantly by the grace of the Lord, symbolized by the Eucharist and exemplified by the Eucharist. And finally, that last temptation here in Luke's Gospel, this corresponds to chastity, not in the external, narrow sense of the word, dealing with sexuality, but not trying to make a show of yourself. Modesty in both senses of the word. So modesty often refers to your dress, etc., your self-presentation, but your self-presentation in a broader sense, you're modest. You don't bring attention to yourself. So Jesus is not going to throw himself down and bring attention to himself. Some of the most unchaste impulses in the world today are fame and money. I'm going to become famous. I'm going to become an influencer on TikTok with 1 million followers. Wow, wow, wow. That's unchaste. You're at the service of others. If you can do that by being an influencer on TikTok, well, okay. But it's not to draw attention to yourself, to show how much power and greatness and wit you have. Nobody cares. Use your gifts to be at the service of others, as Jesus did, not to draw attention to himself. So these are really challenging for us. Our ego is so needy and so fragile. It's because it's an illusion to begin with. It doesn't really exist. It's not going to last. It's not your real self. But our ego, with our little opinions and our minds and our desires and all of that, has to be continually shored up, with all sorts of reassurances. I'm really okay, I'm good, I'm great, I have power. Leave it. Your true self is much more precious and magnificent than that. It's a radiant diamond, radiating God's light and love and joy to the world. Just like God is radiance itself, radiating love, joy, and peace to the world. We are children of God. We're made in his image. We're called to share that. That's true life. That's our true self. That's who we really are. That's who God really is. Continual giving of joy and peace into the world without counting and without discrimination. It all comes back. As you give, so will you get. The measure you give will be the measure you get. It's God's own Trinitarian life exemplified and manifested in the world. So stop identifying with your measly little thoughts and opinions and needs and desires and all that. You have to let go of that ego. To do that, you need some therapy probably, but in the process, you will be able to be liberated from that illusion and be able to, live like Jesus. Resist all the temptations, the self-centeredness of all those temptations, the illusion and the stupidity and the idiocy of those temptations, of living that way, which is death already. But die to your ego and learn how to live. Whoever loses his life, for my sake, will find it. Try it out. It works. That's the challenge of Lent. This Lent and all Lents and all our lives.